Okay.
Appreciate
So I worked for Steve twice, 1983 to 1987 and 1995 to 1997. I worked at Apple twice. The first time was in the Macintosh division. So he was obviously running the division. And reporting to him was a guy named Mike Murray, who was director of marketing. And reporting to him was a guy named Mike Boych, who was in charge of all evangelism. And I reported to Mike Boych. And this was in 1983 to 1987. It was a great time. We were on this mission from God, i.e. Steve, to change the world, to prevent worldwide domination by IBM. We looked at IBM as, you know, the devil. And it was a great time. It was some of the brightest people that I've ever met working on this great project. And, you know, we thought we had to change the world. Steve is remarkable. I think in the history of man, in terms of business visionaries, there's probably been two, Walt Disney and Steve Jobs. Lots of people claim to be visionaries and throw the V word around, and I don't think that most people qualify. You know, if you look at Steve, he did Apple I, Apple II, Macintosh, iPod, iPhone, iPad. You know, that's 6 things. Any one of those 6 would qualify you to be a visionary, but he did 6. So I can't think of anybody who's even close to that. He was very difficult to work for. He did not suffer fools. He wasn't a warm and fuzzy kind of guy. He would tell you you're a piece of shit in front of, you know, anybody. He kind of ruled by fear. Fear of embarrassment, fear of humiliation. You know, if you looked at everything you've been taught about HR, he did the opposite, basically. So, you know, if you draw a 2x2 matrix, because I think the whole world can be reduced to a 2x2 matrix. So on one axis is asshole, not asshole, and the other vertical axis is great and crap. So I think a lot of people have figured out, you know, how to be assholes. So that part is easy. But you want to be an asshole who's great. Ideally, you'd be a nice person who's great. But, you know, you can't ask for everything. So there's a lot of people who figured out the asshole crap part. Steve was truly, you know, the great part. And some of the dangers of Steve Jobs is that you look at him and it's very difficult to separate correlation from causation. And it's also very difficult to extrapolate what he did and make it apply to your organization. So at one example, you know, he drove a Mercedes. So this doesn't mean if you take a bozo and stick him in a Mercedes, you would get a Steve Jobs. Okay, that's correlation. That's not causation. On the other hand, if you look at what Apple to this day, the whole world is telling you you should be open and transparent and engage your customers. Apple's 0 for 3 there, right? So Apple is the anti-social company. Have you ever heard of an Apple Twitter account, an Apple Google Plus account, an Apple Facebook fan page? Have you heard of, you know, fireside chats with the CEO? Have you heard of anything like that? 0, zippo, nada. You know, if you're a blogger and you release confidential Apple information, you know, the Gestapo is going to be knocking on your door trying to arrest you. Apple does so many things opposite to what the common wisdom is. So a lot of those things I don't necessarily agree with. I actually think Apple could be even greater if it did embrace social media. But, you know, who am I? So Steve Jobs is a very interesting case. I don't think that you can draw inspiration from him. You can draw lessons from him. But I would caution against going into Steve Jobs emulation mode, because he was truly, truly one of a kind. And not everybody can pull it off. It's going to be very interesting for Apple now, because with Steve, the rules didn't apply to Apple. I mean, you could get away with a lot. You could get away with, you know, imprisoning bloggers if they released your confidential information. You could get away with all that kind of crap. You could tell, you know, big conferences that you won't speak unless it's at a certain time and a certain place, and, you know, you have to have water brought in from Tibet that the monks gathered from the well, and you have to have this special chair built in Germany by Hans, you know, the chair builder, for you to sit on stage. You know, Steve could get away with that. Could all the mini Steves at Apple get away with that? I don't think so. So it's going to be a very interesting time for Apple now.